A sunlit hallway, the kind that smells faintly of carpet glue and old printers, the kind that has seen 1,000 conferences come and go. A white man pauses at the sight of an older black woman studying the program and smiles the way people smile when they think they're being helpful. "Are you lost?" he asks with that breezy certainty that says, "This is my building, my world, my right to orient you." She holds his gaze, a half-beat longer than politeness requires, the corner of her mouth hitching upward, not in deference but in recognition. She tilts her head toward the phone in his hand as it chirps a familiar directive. "In 200 feet, turn left." The voice guiding him sounds like authority. He trusts it without thinking. He does not know that she devoted her life to making that voice possible. He does not know that the equations she wrestled into submission are the reason his phone can find him, and that the only person who has never been lost in this exchange is the woman he assumes needs directions. This is the story of a mathematician who did her work so precisely that it disappeared into everybody's everyday, and of the everyday indignities that tried to tell her she did not belong in the rooms where she was indispensable. It is the story of a black girl in segregated Virginia whose love of numbers led her to the front lines of space-age computation, and of the persistent hum of racism that tried to define her as an error term at every step. It is a story about power measured in microseconds and meters, about satellites and stubbornness, about what it takes to chart the globe when the world keeps insisting you don't know where you are. And it is, above all, an invitation to listen differently, to hear the voice inside the devices we carry, and recognize the woman who helped teach them how to speak. She grew up in the tidewater stretch of Virginia, where the land is a quiet, relentless geometry, flat fields, straight furrows, horizons that teach your eye to love a line. Her parents knew work that bent the back. Tobacco and corn made a living, but not a future. At home, the kitchen table groaned with more than food. It held the weight of expectations, the hushed negotiations between the cost of a book and the price of a winter coat, the arithmetic of survival that taught a child to respect numbers, because numbers do not lie and do not pity, and do not look at you and ask if you are lost. She loved the neatness of answers, how an equation could be a puzzle box and a key at the same time. At school, she learned quickly there were 2 tests in every classroom, the one on the paper and the one in the air. The first judged whether she understood calculus. The second judged whether she understood the delicate choreography of being quiet, being brilliant, and being black and female in a place that suspected all 3. The South, she knew, was a study in contradictions, a place that could recite scripture about loving thy neighbor and yet draw a hard line at schoolhouse doors, a place where church mothers brought pound cake to graduations and court officers brought tear gas to marches. There were signs to read, colored and white, that tried to teach you your place. But there were other signs too, written on a grandmother's palm pressed to your cheek, or in a teacher's insistence that your mind was a room without a ceiling. At her high school, one math teacher saw the way she leaned into the board, eyes narrowed, as if squinting at a distant coastline. "Go farther," the teacher said. "What's one more step?" In that insistence lay a philosophy that would become her life. You can always refine an answer, and sometimes the difference between failure and a flawless model is that last decimal place. She went to an historically black university because that was the path carved by the ones before her, a corridor of brilliance with portraits of alumni on the walls and faculty who understood that excellence is a form of protection. There, she majored in mathematics, a choice that elicited the usual mix of admiration and skepticism from those who measured life in safer increments. Numbers were not an easy haven for girls in those days. Numbers were the province of men, we were told, and the few women who ventured into that landscape often had to wear their competence like armor. She wore it lightly, not because the battle wasn't real, but because she refused to let it bend her shoulders forward. She learned to code with punch cards, to think in loops and branches before the language of loops and branches existed in common speech. She learned to talk to machines like old acquaintances, politely, precisely, without fear. Segregation was the blatant war. Sexism was the quieter siege. For a black woman in mathematics in the mid-20th century, the path into the halls of research wasn't a corridor. It was a crawl space. She earned her degree and took a teaching job, the kind of work that made sense. Solid, honorable, until a recruiter mentioned a naval base upriver that needed computers. In those days, a computer was a person. Later, it would mean rooms full of machines that blinked like stubborn constellations. Either way, the work was similar. Take messy data and make it sing. She applied, she interviewed, she held back the part of her that wanted to say, "I can do this better than you think I can." They hired her. She walked into a world of uniforms and clearance badges, where the coffee pots were labeled not by contents but by proximity to power, and learned to find the nearest quiet corner. Into that quiet, she poured a life. By the time the exchange in the hallway took place, the "Are you lost?" and the smile like a tiny shield, she had weathered decades of smaller cuts you could mistake for paper until you saw the scars. On her first week at the base, a supervisor inadvertently used the wrong name, not once but for a month, a slip that told her his eye did not trust what it saw. At project meetings, she learned to read the choreographies of interruption, who was allowed to talk, and how long a sentence could get before it was cut off. She learned to put her ideas in memos that would float through the hierarchy like bottled messages, arriving in the right hands without the distraction of her face attached to them. And in the cafeteria, she learned to sit with other women who carried slide rules and socket wrenches to eat quick and laugh low, to swap gossip about firmware patches and church picnics, to remind each other that invisibility could be a strategy if you chose it, not a sentence if it was imposed. The particular afternoon in question was a conference bearing one of those titles that pretend to say everything and actually say nothing. Acronyms clustered like gnats. The walls were covered in posters about ionospheric delay and orbital modeling and error ellipses, the kind of topics she had spent years mapping in her head. The man with the helpful smile, he wore a badge, not a uniform, a consultant perhaps, had stopped because her face did not match the composite he carried in his mind of who attended such gatherings. She had just stepped out of a session on geodesy, the science of Earth's shape, and was ruminating about how a model could need a hair's breadth correction and still work like a miracle. The phone in his hand chirped its instruction, and that was when she felt the irony thread itself into the room, like a drumbeat others couldn't hear. She could have told him she wasn't lost. She could have told him she had found the planet's center of mass so his phone could pretend to know where he was. Instead, she said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," and let the words find their own orbit. That incident was not a lightning strike. It was a flare illuminating a weather system already in motion. In earlier years, the base had posted jobs for computers that quietly sorted women by race. She had colleagues who could do the math blindfolded and still couldn't get their names on the papers. She had watched a white junior engineer get promoted after presenting a paper that relied on her code, his voice steady as he walked through a graph she recognized like a fingerprint. She had known the tightness in the chest that comes when someone repeats your idea in a lower octave and the room suddenly hears it. She had known the sweetness of small victories, too. The day an analyst stopped by her desk and asked if she could walk him through a matrix because she made the math feel like a map. The week a test satellite's telemetry finally aligned with her model's predictions within a range that made the team exhale in unison, like a choir hitting a note. But the hallway exchange was a concentrated dose of a broader toxin, the assumption that black women are perennially out of place, even as they lay the rails others ride on. Outside the base, the world offered variations on the theme. In a department store, a clerk followed her with the ambling boredom of someone who has already decided who you are. At a gas station off the highway, a man asked if she was sure she had the money before he swiped her card. At church even, a visiting usher confided he was surprised to learn she worked with all that science, as if a hymn and a differential equation could not share a brain. In each scene, her mind supplied a counterfactual image. The globe, grid-lined, turning beneath a net of satellites whose whispers she had learned to decode. There are kinds of knowledge you can't shake loose from a person. And there are ways Society tries anyway, asking, "Are you lost?" As a proxy for "do you belong," ironically, the thing they called lostness had been her life's obsession: error. Everything that makes modern navigation work is about bounding error, accounting for the ways signals bend and lag, tricked by the atmosphere or the Earth's uneven gravity. To chart the planet with precision, she and her colleagues had to model the geoid, the wrinkled, lopsided shape of Earth's oceans if stilled, and allowed to settle under gravity and rotation alone, and then account for all the ways that model meets messy reality. They had to write code that eats anomalies for breakfast. They had to correct for a satellite's orbit wobbling like a toddler with a hula hoop. They had to tell a receiver how to time a signal with the arrogance of a Swiss watch and the humility of a front porch storyteller. They had to turn lost from an existential fear into a solvable problem. Society, alas, likes its errors human. It prefers a black woman's presence to be the glitch it corrects, the quiet request to show ID in a building you've worked in for years, the joke at a holiday party that pretends to be harmless and lands like a stinger. On the day the hallway incident happened, she walked into the plenary session and let the panelists' voices wash over her. Somewhere in the margin of her program, she wrote a single sentence: "We are the correction." It was not anger. It was a thesis. A life's work in 5 words. The struggle for a woman like her was not a march with placards, though she admired those who marched and slipped money in envelopes for those who needed bail. Her struggle was a daily negotiation between precision and patience. In an era when women in STEM were still a novelty, and black women in STEM an exception that made people squint, she mastered both the math and the room. Resistance, for her, looked like refusing to let the architecture of bias distort her measurements of self. It looked like arriving early and staying late not because she had to prove something to them, but because she had promised something to herself, that the models would be right, that the code would be clean, that the thing in her mind would exist in the world and work as designed. She found allies where she could. A white colleague with a soft spot for hard problems learned to defer to her on anything that touched geodesy, and, over time, came to think of himself as her student. A black engineer from another division began stopping by her office on Fridays to exchange notes and encouragement, their conversations pinging back and forth like a signal bouncing off the ionosphere. A secretary, one of those women the world underestimates at its peril, taught her the politics of calendars and who to CC, which is to say, how to make sure the right people saw the right things at the right time. A young woman intern with high braids like a crown sat at her elbow one summer and wrote a loop so elegant that the older woman, after she read it, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for having lived to see the day. Outside the gates, she kept another discipline. She visited classrooms, not as an inspirational story, but as a mathematician. She taught children to hear the music in math, the way an equation's symmetry could click like a lock opening. She brought a battered globe to talk about orbits and time, set it spinning, and asked a child to point to home. She smiled when the child poked somewhere near, not at the exact coordinate, and used the moment to talk about error bounds, what it means to be close and then closer, what it means to refuse the lie that any answer must be perfect on the first try. In church basements and school gyms, her chalk clicked as she sketched arcs in the air, her voice steady as she trained a generation to look at the sky and see not mystery, but conversation. The resistance also looked like self-preservation. She learned to take days away from the numbers to let her eyes rest. She cooked family recipes that folded the past into the present with better success than any algorithm could. She called friends and told jokes that had nothing to do with telemetry. When a younger colleague, black, brilliant, weary, showed up in her office and asked how to make it to retirement with his soul intact, she said, "Let the work be yours. Let the hurt be theirs. That way you get to keep what's worth keeping." It became a kind of benediction in the halls, passed quietly from mouth to mouth. Let the work be yours. Let the hurt be theirs. And when the city erupted, because every decade brings its own flashpoint, every generation discovers the wheel of grief anew. She walked in solidarity beside those whose struggle was more visible than hers. She made posters with high schoolers who had learned to code in her summer classes, posters that measured anger, not in decibels, but in degrees of commitment. She took her place under the shade of a tree at a rally and listened to speeches that braided policy and poetry, and when someone asked if it mattered, any of it, she said what mathematicians say when they know a model converges. It matters because we are closer than we were. Recognition can take the form of a medal pinned to a lapel, but the real climax of her story arrived long before any ceremony. It came in a laboratory when a receiver chirped with a new confidence, when numbers on a console lined up as if the universe had finally decided to admit what she knew in her bones, that the model worked. The team had been fighting a stubborn drift, signals arriving with a delay that made the map on a prototype screen jitter, and the tiny digital car stutter along a highway that, in the real world, was smooth. The culprit was atmospheric, electrons dancing in the ionosphere, playing tricks with time. She had a hunch, the kind you get after years in the field, that if they weighted a particular variable differently, if they paid more attention to how the sun's activity could swell the atmosphere like a deep breath, the drift would quiet. She wrote the code with that adjustment in mind, fed it into the beast of a mainframe, and waited through the slow exhalation of a compile. The screen blinked. The receiver chirped. The digital car on the display began to glide as if someone had finally oiled the wheels of the cosmos. Around her, the room made its own small noises, shoulders dropping, a pen tapping a new, happier rhythm. Against a clipboard, she did not raise her hands in triumph. She smiled the kind of smile that carries decades in it and said, "All right then," as if she had persuaded a child to do what it knew was right all along. Publicly, the climax many people point to is that moment in late career when the world turned its face toward her and said, "We see you." Speeches were made. Articles were written that tried to compress a lifetime into a few hundred words and a photograph. Young journalists with the urgency of the newly converted asked her what it felt like to be foundational. She answered with the same grace she brought to meetings where no one knew her name, and with a precision that refused to let the story become myth. She talked about team science, about the way satellites talk to receivers, the way bees talk to flowers, about the miracle that happens when things built by human hands behave like part of nature. She talked about the limits of individual genius as an explanation for anything worth doing. And then she acknowledged something that had been true since her first day at the base: it matters to be seen. The other climax came in the culture at large. All at once, people began asking where the voices in their machines came from, who taught them to pronounce the names of streets, and to ask questions, and to answer with a competence you could put in your pocket. There was a tenderness in the sudden curiosity and a danger. It is easy, in the age of myth-making, to choose a single face and call it the architect, to lift one woman high enough that you no longer have to look around and see the multitude she stands on. When they asked whom to thank, she offered a list that sounded like a litany: colleagues and mentors and interns, mathematicians who came before and programmers who came after, a mother who handed her a pencil when other children got dolls, teacher who refused to let the class move on until every student understood why the derivative of a constant is zero. If anyone thought her humility was rehearsed, they had not seen her on the days when the code misbehaved and she spoke to it, with the stern patience of a choir director who knows the tenors can do better. The long arc of resolution is not a single ribbon cutting. It is a series of openings, a door ajar here, a window unlatched there, through which air enters a room that had been stale. In the years after the hallway exchange, after the medals and the profiles and the polite astonishment that someone like her had done something like this, she made a point to turn the spotlight into a lantern, carrying it to places where a young person might be waiting for proof that the world contains a place that fits the shape of their mind. She visited predominantly white schools, where a black girl sat in the second row, and did not raise her hand because she had learned to survive by folding herself small. She visited underfunded schools where the ceilings stained brown at the seams, and the chairs wobbled, where brilliance bloomed anyway like a weed whose roots ignore concrete. She brought the same battered globe and the same quick hands and made the same offer. Here is how to find your position when the world keeps trying to move under you. Her story began to braid into the stories of others, some in science and some simply in the business of keeping hope alive. A poet wrote lines that compared her equations to quilts. A painter used her face as a study in blue light and quiet joy. A young coder wore a t-shirt with an equation from one of her early papers and found that strangers would stop him on the subway and ask about it, and he would tell them, a little nervous at first, and then less so, about satellites and clocks, and a woman who kept time for the world. The collective signal strengthened. Inside institutions, the work of resolution meant policy. Hiring managers who had relied on familiar networks learned to listen to unfamiliar resumes. Promotion committees learned to ask different questions about impact, to recognize the signatures of invisible labor. Offices learned to accommodate the needs of caretakers and the reality of bodies that carry histories. The shift was uneven, contested, and incomplete, as all shifts worth having are, but it happened. When a younger scientist put forward an idea and the room fell silent in the old way, someone cleared their throat and said, "Let her finish." The room adjusted, slowly, to a new equilibrium. Personally, resolution looked like the ordinary grace of a well-lived life. She took walks at dusk when the air cooled and the sky figured out how to be both pink and gray at once. She read novels. On Sundays, she kept a small garden of herbs and marveled, as all mathematicians secretly do, at the way life refuses to be reduced to symbols. When she traveled, people would sometimes recognize her, a small shock for a woman who had spent decades wearing a cloak of invisibility by choice or necessity. She accepted the hugs and the thanks with a mixture of delight and a private wonder that the world had finally found its way to her door. Her grandchildren, when they were small, would brag to classmates that their grandmother made the phone talk, and while it wasn't technically correct, it was morally true and she did not correct them. The man from the hallway. She saw him again at a subsequent conference. He had read about her by then. He stopped, eyes a little wide, and offered a halting apology that tripped over itself and turned into gratitude. "I didn't know," he said. She nodded, not unkindly. "That's how it works," she said. "You're not supposed to know. You're supposed to trust the signal." He laughed, a little embarrassed, and they talked shop for a minute about the latest ways to mitigate multipath interference. She reveled in the pivot, how quickly a conversation can move from false assumptions to shared curiosity when pride is set aside. Later she thought about that moment and tagged it mentally not as triumph but as a lesson. Knowledge is a bridge, but only if you choose to cross it. In a life defined by coordinates, the most important point she plotted might be this: belonging is not a gift you wait to be given. It is a function you learn to compute from first principles, a practice of saying, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," and then backing it with work no one can deny. Her story teaches a set of truths we can carry into every boardroom and classroom, onto every bus and into every voting booth. First, that racism often arrives wearing a smile and carrying a map, certain of its right to orient you. Second, that the best resistance is both collective and precise. It does not simply refuse a lie, it builds a truth strong enough to live in. Third, that the quieter heroes among us, the ones whose labor becomes so ubiquitous we forget it is labor, deserve not just retroactive thanks but proactive equity. If this story stirred something in you, let it stir your feet, your voice, your pen. Show up for the child who loves numbers and refuses to apologize for it. Advocate for curricula that honor the minds of girls and the genius of Black children, not as exceptions, but as expectations. Push your institutions to measure what matters, and reward the labor that currently goes unpriced. Mentorship, community building, the small daily acts that make science kinder without making it less rigorous. When you hear the voice on your phone telling you where to go, take a breath. And remember the hands that calibrated the world so that voice could seem omniscient. And when you encounter someone in a hallway whose face does not fit your expectation of who belongs there, ask a different question than "Are you lost?" Ask instead, "What do you know that I should learn?" Because here is the final orientation this story offers. No one who helps the world find itself is ever lost. The woman whose equations quieted the jitter of a digital car on a pixelated road did more than bring us home. She modeled a way to move through a world that sometimes wants to unmoor us. She taught us to trust the signal we carry inside, to refine it with work, to anchor it in community. And she reminded us that even in a universe of orbits and error bounds, some truths are fixed. Dignity is not granted. It is claimed. Knowledge is not the possession of the few. It is a commons built by the many. And belonging, in the end, is not a destination your phone can tell you about. It is the quiet, righteous knowledge that you are exactly where you need to be, and that the rest of us are better off because you are there.